The afternoon sun cuts through the dusty windows of a converted warehouse in Yokohama, September 23, 1945. The war has been over for exactly 39 days. Admiral Soemu Toyoda straightens the collar of his white dress uniform as an American jeep pulls to a stop outside what was once a textile factory. The building now serves as a temporary headquarters for the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, a massive documentation effort to understand exactly how Japan was defeated, and more importantly, and what Japan knew while it was happening. Toyoda expects another round of questions about naval tactics, about the decision to attack Pearl Harbor, about the desperate campaigns in the Philippine Sea. What he does not expect is the single piece of paper waiting for him in a second-floor conference room. A chart, production figures, numbers that will, in the span of 15 minutes, reframe every naval engagement he commanded, every strategy session he attended, every loss he tried to rationalize. The numbers on that chart will answer a question that haunted him through sleepless nights aboard the battleship Nagato, through the grinding retreats of 1944, through the final desperate months when kamikaze pilots threw themselves at an enemy that never seemed to diminish. Why did we keep losing? If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The answer waiting in that room is not a matter of tactics or courage. It is mathematics. Cold, brutal, undeniable mathematics that will reveal Japan fought the entire war based on an intelligence failure so catastrophic, so fundamental, that it guaranteed defeat before the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. This is the story of the moment Japan's naval leadership learned they had been fighting blind. To understand the weight of what Admiral Toyoda is about to see, you must first understand what the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about their enemy in December 1941. Japanese naval intelligence was not incompetent. In the years before the war, they conducted extensive surveillance of American military capacity. Officers posed as businessmen, touring American shipyards. They photographed facilities from coastal vantage points. They analyzed congressional appropriations bills, industrial surveys, and steel production figures. They studied American performance in the First World War, calculating ship construction times, examining the mobilization curve from peacetime to war production. The picture that emerged seemed comprehensive. America possessed significant industrial capacity. This was never in dispute. But the intelligence assessments concluded that American industrial might was a latent threat, not an immediate one. Shipbuilding was a complex process requiring skilled labor, specialized facilities, and years of sustained effort. You could not simply will a fleet into existence. The strategic calculation developed by the Imperial Navy's planning staff operated from this foundation. A surprise attack on Pearl Harbor would eliminate the Pacific Fleet's battleship force, buying Japan 18 to 24 months to consolidate conquests across Southeast Asia and establish a defensive perimeter. During this window, America would mobilize, yes, but the mobilization would be slow. Japan estimated American shipyards might produce 50 to perhaps 100 major warships during this period. Enough to present a challenge, but not enough to break through fortified island chains defended by land-based aircraft and a still formidable Japanese fleet. The plan rested on a psychological assumption as much as a material one. Japanese military theorists believed Americans lacked the spiritual fortitude for a protracted war. The surprise blow at Pearl Harbor would demoralize a soft, democracy-weakened nation. The extended defensive campaign would bleed American resolve. Eventually, a negotiated peace would preserve Japan's sphere of influence. Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, chief of the operations section of the Naval General Staff, later testified that pre-war estimates projected American naval construction would reach approximately 200 major vessels by 1945, a generous estimate that factored in maximum industrial effort. Even this figure seemed almost overwhelming. It represented a production advantage of roughly 5-to-1 over Japanese capacity, but Japanese planners believed their forces were qualitatively superior. Better night fighting doctrine, the oxygen-fueled long-lance torpedo that outranged anything in the American arsenal, the Zero fighter, which could outmaneuver any American aircraft in service in 1941, superior naval gunnery training, Bushido spirit, the willingness to fight to the death that American sailors, soft from peacetime luxury, supposedly lacked. Quality would compensate for quantity. Experience would trump raw numbers. This was not irrational thinking. It was based on careful analysis of the military balance in December 1941. Japan had battle-hardened forces fresh from years of combat in China. America had a peacetime military only beginning to expand. The Japanese Navy had been preparing for this war since the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. They had drilled, refined tactics, built purpose-designed vessels for Pacific combat. On December 7, 1941, when Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led the first wave of aircraft over Oahu, the plan seemed sound. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. 8 battleships sunk or damaged. Hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground. American forces scattered across a Pacific that suddenly belonged to Japan. In the months that followed, Japanese confidence seemed justified by events. Hong Kong fell on December 25, 1941, 18 days of fighting. Wake Island surrendered January 20th after a heroic but doomed defense. The Philippines campaign saw American and Filipino forces steadily pushed into the Bataan Peninsula, then overwhelmed. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered February 15, 1942, the largest capitulation in British military history. The Dutch East Indies, with its crucial oil reserves, fell in March. Burma followed in May. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the Central Pacific, from the Aleutians to the approaches of Australia. The defensive perimeter was larger than planned, the conquests faster than anticipated. American forces had been driven back to Hawaii and a few isolated bases. The Philippines, America's major regional colony, was under Japanese occupation. The war seemed to be proceeding according to design. Then came the Battle of Midway, June 4th through 7th, 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, sank in a single engagement. The core of Japan's carrier strike force, the veteran air crews who had attacked Pearl Harbor, were gone in one afternoon. The loss of the carriers was catastrophic, but the loss of experienced pilots was irreplaceable. Japan's naval aviation training program could not produce replacement aviators at the rate American programs could. Still, the disaster at Midway was explainable within the framework of Japanese strategic thinking. Bad intelligence about American carrier positions. Poor operational security. American codebreakers had read Japanese naval communications and positioned forces accordingly. Unlucky timing when American dive bombers caught Japanese carriers in the vulnerable moments of rearming aircraft. Circumstance. Fortune. The variables of war. The plan could still work. Losses could be replaced. The defensive perimeter would hold. But then, reports from the field began to paint a puzzling picture. By late 1942, during the grinding Guadalcanal campaign, Japanese commanders started noting something odd in their engagement reports. American destroyer screens were consistently at full strength. Damaged vessels appeared, repaired, and back in service faster than seemed possible. Supply convoys operated with escort forces that should have required stripping other theaters of protection. Captain Toshikazu Omei, serving on Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's staff, later recalled reviewing reconnaissance reports from the Solomons in early 1943. One report documented a supply convoy with 32 transport vessels escorted by 8 destroyers and 4 escort carriers. The numbers seemed impossible. Where was America getting this many ships? Japanese intelligence officers proposed explanations. Perhaps America was transferring vessels from the Atlantic theater, where the U-boat campaign was supposedly tying down resources. Perhaps they were counting civilian merchant ships converted for military use. Perhaps combat fatigue was causing reconnaissance pilots to overcount vessels in large formations. But the reports kept accumulating. Throughout 1943, every major engagement seemed to involve American forces larger than anticipated. The invasion of Tarawa in November involved more than 200 ships for a single atoll. The logistics were staggering. Not just the combat vessels, but the support ships, oilers, ammunition ships, repair vessels, hospital ships, transports. Japanese strategy had accounted for fighting the American military. It had not accounted for fighting American industrial capacity directly. Every campaign became a war of attrition that Japan could not win. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding forces in the Marianas, reportedly told his staff in early 1944, "We sink 3 of their destroyers in one engagement, and 5 appear in the next. We destroy their transports, and larger convoys arrive the following week. Where are they building these ships?" Japanese naval intelligence revised their estimates upward. Perhaps American production had reached 300 major vessels, then 400. By late 1944, some analysts were suggesting the actual figure might be as high as 500. Even these catastrophically high numbers seemed inadequate to explain what Japanese forces were encountering in the Pacific. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, what American pilots would call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, saw Japanese naval aviation effectively destroyed. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were shot down in 2 days. American losses were minimal. The qualitative superiority Japan had counted on had evaporated. American pilots flying newer aircraft, trained in larger numbers, supported by radar-directed fighter control, simply overwhelmed Japanese forces through a combination of technology and numbers. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan committed nearly everything remaining to stopping the American invasion of the Philippines. The resulting engagement sprawled across hundreds of miles of ocean, involving hundreds of ships in multiple separate actions. It was the largest naval battle in history. Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the center force driving toward the landing beaches, encountered an American escort carrier group off Samar. These were small carriers, designed for convoy protection and support operations, screened by destroyers and destroyer escorts. They were not fleet carriers. They were not the main American battle line. Yet even this secondary force put up such fierce resistance, and reinforcements appeared so quickly that Kurita, believing he was facing a much larger force, ordered a retreat at the moment of potential victory. He later testified that he believed he was engaging the entire American Third Fleet, that the volume of ships and aircraft seemed impossible to be anything else. He was wrong. The main American carrier task forces were hundreds of miles away, chasing a decoy force. What Kurita had encountered was the kind of secondary force that America could now field routinely, the kind of force that Japan could only assemble by stripping every theatre of shipping. This was the context in which Japanese naval officers began contemplating defeat in 1945. Not sudden catastrophic collapse, but slow grinding erosion. Every replaced ship took longer to build. Every lost pilot represented irreplaceable training hours. Every campaign stretched supply lines further, while American forces operated from a logistics network of staggering scale. Officers like Admiral Toyoda understood they were losing. What they did not understand was the true scale of the disparity. They believed they were being outproduced by a factor of 5, perhaps 8 to 1. They believed American industrial capacity, while formidable, was still bounded by the physical limitations of shipbuilding. They believed this because their pre-war intelligence, carefully researched and documented, said so. They believed this because no nation in history had produced warships at rates faster than traditional construction methods allowed. They believed this until Admiral Toyoda walked into that conference room in Yokohama and saw the actual numbers. The room is sparse. A long wooden table, chairs, windows overlooking the harbour, where American vessels sit at anchor, so many vessels that crowd the available berths. Present are Admiral Toyoda, Vice Admiral Fukudome, several junior Japanese naval officers, and a team from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey led by a Navy commander whose name appears in documents as Commander Hansen. The Americans have been conducting these interviews for weeks, working through the Japanese military hierarchy, documenting decisions and understanding the enemy's perspective. It is partially intelligence work, understanding what Japan knew and when they knew it, and partially historical documentation for future study. On the table are folders containing Japanese intelligence estimates from various periods of the war. Next to them, American documents marked with fresh declassification stamps. The contrast between the two sets of papers represents the gap between perception and reality that defined the Pacific War. Commander Hansen, according to later testimony from interpreters present, opens the session methodically. The Americans want to understand Japanese pre-war estimates of American industrial capacity. They want to know how Japanese intelligence revised these estimates as the war progressed. They want to map the evolution of Japanese strategic thinking. Admiral Toyoda responds carefully. He describes the pre-war surveys, the careful analysis of American shipyard capacity, and the calculated estimates of production rates. He explains that by 1943, Japanese intelligence had concluded America would produce several hundred major warships. By 1944, they had revised this to perhaps 500 vessels. Vice Admiral Fukudome adds detail. He describes how these estimates, even the high ones, seemed catastrophically large, how they forced Japan into increasingly desperate tactical adaptations, how the kamikaze attacks emerged partially from the mathematics of attrition. If conventional attacks couldn't sink ships fast enough, perhaps suicide attacks could change the exchange ratio. The Japanese officers speak with the careful dignity of defeated commanders who nevertheless fulfilled their duties with honor. They do not make excuses. They acknowledge underestimating American industrial capacity. They admit their intelligence failed to grasp the scale of American mobilization. Then Commander Hansen slides a document across the table. Admiral, these are the actual United States Navy production figures from December 1941 through August 1945. They were declassified last week specifically for these interviews. The document is typed on U.S. Navy letterhead, dense with columns of numbers, ship types, construction dates, Classification by vessel category. The numbers are organized chronologically, showing monthly and yearly production rates. Admiral Toyoda picks up the document. His expression, carefully controlled throughout the interview, shifts as he reads. The room is very quiet. According to testimonies from interpreters and American officers present documented in strategic bombing survey records and later historical accounts, what follows is a moment of profound psychological dislocation. Admiral Toyoda reads through the first page, then the second, then looks up at Commander Hansen. In English, Toyoda had learned some English before the war. He says, "These numbers are not correct. It is not said with anger. It is said with certainty. The numbers cannot be correct because they are impossible." Commander Hansen responds, "Sir, I assure you these figures come directly from the Navy Department's Bureau of Ships. They represent all vessels commissioned by the United States Navy between December 7th, 1941 and August 15th, 1945. They have been verified against construction records from every major American shipyard." Toyoda hands the document to Fukudome. The Vice Admiral begins reading, his finger tracing down the columns of figures. His face, witnesses later recalled, goes pale. Here is what the document showed. Fleet carriers, the large, fast carriers designed to project power across vast distances, 27 constructed during the war. Light carriers, smaller, faster vessels built on cruiser hulls, 9 constructed. Escort carriers, small carriers built for convoy protection and amphibious support, 115 constructed. Total carrier production, 151. Japan's pre-war estimate for all categories combined, approximately 40 to 50 carriers by war's end. Full-sized fleet destroyers, 349 constructed. Japan's estimate, approximately 150. A category Japan had not calculated separately, smaller than destroyers, but capable of anti-submarine warfare and convoy escort, 498 constructed. Japan possessed no equivalent category. The production figure alone exceeded their estimates for all American destroyer-type vessels. 203 were constructed. Japan's estimate, 70 to 80. Heavy cruisers, 13. Light cruisers, 34. Japan's estimate, approximately 25 total. 10 constructed, including Iowa-class fast battleships mounting 9 16-inch guns, the most powerful surface combatants afloat. Japan had believed American battleship construction would be limited by treaty restrictions and industrial priorities. 10 new battleships represented a massive commitment of resources Japan had not anticipated. The document continued. Landing ships, tank LSTs, the massive vessels that could beach themselves and disgorge armor directly onto hostile shores, 1,051 constructed. Landing ships, medium, 558. Landing craft, infantry, 933. The amphibious warfare fleet alone vessels, designed to project force onto beaches, exceeded Japan's estimates for total American naval construction. Then came the auxiliary vessels, the ships that made the American fleet possible, but that Japanese intelligence had largely overlooked in combat assessments. Oilers for refueling at sea, 216. Cargo ships and transports, hundreds more. Hospital ships, repair ships, ammunition ships, submarine tenders, the vast logistics network that allowed American task forces to operate thousands of miles from home ports for months at a time. And finally, the merchant marine. The Liberty ships mass-produced cargo vessels built using revolutionary prefabrication techniques, 2,710 constructed. Victory ships, a more advanced design, 531 constructed. In total, counting all categories, American shipyards had produced more than 5,000 naval and merchant vessels during the war. Vice Admiral Fukudomi sets down the document. He sits back in his chair. For a long moment, he simply stares at the ceiling. Then he speaks in Japanese. The interpreter translates, "I do not understand how this was possible. These numbers represent more ships than every other nation in the war combined." Commander Hansen nods. "Admiral, that assessment is approximately correct. At peak production in 1944, American shipyards were launching more tonnage every month than Japan produced in the entire war." Toyoda picks up the document again. He reads through it a second time, as if hoping the numbers will have changed. They have not. He asks, "When did you reach these production levels?" Hansen consults his notes. "Sir, by mid-1943, American shipyards were operating at near-peak capacity. The escort carrier program alone was producing one vessel every 5 days at that point. By the end of 1943, the United States Navy had more active carriers than Japan had possessed at the start of the war. The implications settle over the room like physical weight. By mid-1943, during the Solomons campaign, before the Gilbert's invasion, well before the decisive battles of 1944, American production had already reached levels that exceeded Japan's total capacity. Every battle fought after that point had been against an enemy growing stronger while Japan grew weaker. The mathematical impossibility of victory was not something that gradually emerged. It had existed since 1943. It had existed before the decisive turning points, before the carrier battles, before the last-ditch defenses. The war had been unwinnable for 2 years before Japan surrendered. Admiral Toyoda asks another question. "These escort carriers, you produced 115. How long did construction take?" Hansen, "The fastest production was achieved by Kaiser Shipyards in Vancouver, Washington. They reduced construction time to approximately 90 days from keel laying to launch. Some vessels were commissioned in under 3 months, 90 days. Japan's largest shipyard, Kure Naval Arsenal, required over a year to construct a single fleet carrier using their best techniques and most skilled workers." Fukudomi interjects with a question about destroyer escorts. Hansen explains they were a new class, designed specifically for mass production using simplified construction methods, prefabricated sections, standardized components, modular design that allowed less skilled workers to assemble vessels quickly. The concept seems alien to the Japanese officers. Warships were not supposed to be mass-produced like automobiles. They required precision craftsmanship, skilled labor, and traditional construction methods refined over centuries of shipbuilding. Yet America had apparently industrialized naval construction to a degree that transformed it into something closer to manufacturing than traditional shipbuilding. Commander Hansen produces another document. This one shows production rates over time, graphed to illustrate the acceleration curve of American mobilization. 1942. Gradual increase as shipyards retooled and expanded. 1943. Explosive growth as new facilities came online and prefabrication techniques matured. 1944. Peak production, with vessels launching faster than crews could be trained to man them. 1945. Sustained high production until Japanese surrender made further construction unnecessary. The graph shows the mobilization curve that Japanese intelligence had predicted, but compressed into half the expected time frame and reaching levels 3 to 4 times higher than the most pessimistic estimates. Admiral Toyoda studies the graph. Then he asks the question that reveals the core tragedy. If we had known these numbers in 1941, if we had understood American capacity could reach these levels, would we have still attacked? It is not a question Commander Hansen can answer, but the silence that follows speaks volumes. The question hangs in the air of that Yokohama conference room. Would Japan have attacked if they had known? Commander Hansen does not answer directly. Instead, he asks Admiral Toyoda about specific battles, about the Solomons campaign, about the carrier battles of 1944, about the desperate defense of the Philippines. In each case, Toyoda describes Japanese tactical thinking, the belief that inflicting heavy casualties would force negotiations, the hope that kamikaze attacks would sink enough carriers to delay invasions, the calculation that even in losing battles, Japan could make the cost of victory unacceptable to Americans. All of it predicated on the assumption that American resources, while vast, were finite, that every sunken carrier represented months of construction time, that sustained losses would erode American strength. Hansen lets him finish. Then he returns to the production charts. Admiral, in the 6 months following the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed, American shipyards commissioned 43 new carriers of all types. In the 3 months after Leyte Gulf, we commissioned 18 fleet and light carriers alone. For every carrier you damaged or sank, we had already launched 2 replacements. The mathematics are crushing. Japan had fought the war believing they were in a contest of attrition, where fighting spirit and tactical skill could compensate for material disadvantage. But the material disadvantage was so vast that no amount of tactical brilliance could matter. Vice Admiral Fukudome asks about the submarine production figures. 203 submarines seemed impossibly high. Japan had devoted enormous resources to anti-submarine warfare, yet American submarines had strangled Japanese merchant shipping, cutting off raw materials from conquered territories. Hansen explains that American submarines operated with advantages beyond numbers. Better torpedoes after fixing the disastrous Mark 14 torpedo problems of 1942, better radar for surface detection, better intelligence from code breaking that allowed submarines to intercept convoys, and most critically, an industrial base that could replace losses faster than Japan could sink submarines. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant vessels faster than Japanese shipyards could replace them. Japan's maritime lifeline to Southeast Asia and the resources that made continued war possible was being systematically severed. The home islands were being starved of oil, rubber, metals, everything needed to sustain military operations. Fukudome presses for details about merchant ship production. The Liberty ship program seems particularly incomprehensible. 2,710 cargo vessels in less than 4 years. Hansen describes the Kaiser shipyard's revolutionary techniques, prefabrication in massive factory buildings where workers could assemble ship sections in controlled conditions, welding instead of riveting, which was faster and required less skilled labor, standardized designs that eliminated custom work, assembly line principles applied to 30-ton steel sections. The record-setting construction of the Liberty ship WWII, Peary 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes from keel laying to launch, was mentioned as proof of concept, though Hansen notes this was a publicity demonstration, not a sustainable production rate. Still, average Liberty ship construction time had been reduced to 42 days by 1944. 42 days. Japanese merchant ship construction took 6 months minimum, often longer as the war situation deteriorated and strategic materials became scarce. Admiral Toyoda asks about steel production. How did America source enough steel for this volume of construction while simultaneously building tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and supporting the British and Soviet war efforts? The answer involves numbers that seem to belong to a different scale of industrial civilization. American steel production in 1944, 81 million tons. Japanese production the same year, 3 million tons. The disparity is not 5-1 or even 10-1. It is 27-1. And this is after years of American steel being diverted to lend-lease shipments to Britain and the Soviet Union. American industrial capacity was fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously while still overwhelming Japanese production. Fukudome does mental calculations that must be arriving at a horrifying conclusion. Japan had not been fighting the United States. Japan had been fighting an industrial system that operated on a fundamentally different scale. Imagine a swordsman, no matter how skilled, attacking a factory. That is the nature of the mismatch these numbers reveal. Commander Hansen produces yet another document. This one compares aircraft production. Japan had been proud of its aviation industry, of the Zero fighter that had dominated early war engagements, of the skilled pilots who had trained for years. American aircraft production, 1941 through 1945, approximately 300,000 aircraft of all types. Japanese production, same period, approximately 70,000, more than 4-1 in raw numbers. But the qualitative gap had also shifted. By 1944, American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair outperformed Japanese aircraft in nearly every metric while being produced in vastly larger numbers. American pilot training programs were graduating thousands of aviators per year. Japanese programs, constrained by fuel shortages and losses of experienced instructors, could not maintain replacement rates. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, represented this gap made manifest. Over 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed in 2 days. Japanese carrier aviation never recovered, not because of lack of courage or fighting spirit, but because the industrial and training base needed to replace those losses simply did not exist. Admiral Toyoda sits quietly through these revelations. His face remains composed, but those present later recalled that he seemed to age visibly during the conversation. The weight of knowledge settled onto him, knowledge of what every kamikaze pilot died not knowing, what every naval officer commanded forces without understanding, what every strategic conference debated while being fundamentally ignorant of the actual balance of forces. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Fukudome asks about the decision-making process. When did American leadership know they would win? When did the production advantage become decisive in strategic planning? Hansen explains that by late 1943, American war planners were operating with confidence that material superiority would guarantee victory. The question was not whether Japan could be defeated, but how quickly and at what cost in American lives. Every strategic decision after mid-1943 assumed American forces could sustain losses that would be rapidly replaced. Island-hopping campaigns were planned, knowing that damaged ships would be repaired or replaced, that aircraft losses could be absorbed, that the logistics network could support multiple simultaneous operations across the Pacific. This is what allowed Admiral Nimitz to conduct the Central Pacific Drive, while General MacArthur advanced through New Guinea. 2 major campaigns, thousands of miles apart, each requiring fleet support that individually exceeded Japan's entire remaining naval strength. Japan had to choose which threat to counter. America could pursue both simultaneously because the industrial base made such operations sustainable. Toyoda asks about intelligence. Did America know that Japan was unaware of these production figures? Hansen's answer is revealing. American intelligence knew Japanese estimates were low, but not how catastrophically low. Captured documents from 1943 showed Japanese planners still believed they could win a war of attrition. American strategic bombing surveys of Japanese industry showed production declining throughout 1944 while American production soared. The strategic bombing campaign itself reflected this disparity. American B-29s bombing Japanese industrial targets flew from bases thousands of miles away, supported by a logistics network of staggering complexity. Each raid required fuel, bombs, spare parts, all transported across the Pacific. Japan could barely defend its home islands, while American forces could project bombing campaigns as routine operations. By the early 1945, Japan's situation was beyond desperate. The home islands were under blockade. Merchant shipping had been reduced to coastal traffic. Strategic materials were nearly exhausted. Food shortages were severe. Yet still, the military leadership believed resistance might force negotiations, might achieve terms better than unconditional surrender. This belief persisted because they did not know what Admiral Toyoda now knows, sitting in this conference room in Yokohama. They did not know that America could sustain the campaign indefinitely, that every Japanese ship sunk or plane shot down meant nothing to an enemy with infinite replacements, that the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not desperately scarce weapons America could barely produce, but rather the opening demonstration of a nuclear program that could manufacture such devices routinely. Commander Hansen mentions this almost casually. The atomic bomb program was supported by industrial infrastructure that dwarfed the Manhattan Project's scientific achievements. The uranium enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge consumed more electricity than entire Japanese cities. The plutonium production reactors at Hanford represented an industrial investment larger than Japan's total spending on military research during the war. Even in defeat, Japan had been facing an enemy whose resources operated on scales they had no framework to comprehend. The conversation in that Yokohama conference room continued for over 3 hours. The Strategic Bombing Survey team asked detailed questions about specific intelligence estimates, about when and how Japanese leadership revised their understanding of American capacity, about whether better intelligence would have changed strategic decisions. Admiral Toyoda answered carefully and honestly. He described the evolution of Japanese estimates, how pre-war confidence had been based on sound analysis of American peacetime capacity, how early victories seemed to confirm Japanese superiority, how the gradual realization of American strength had been too slow, too incomplete to force a fundamental strategic reassessment until far too late. He admitted that even the highest wartime estimates, even the most pessimistic analyses from 1944, had been off by factors of 3 or 4. That Japanese intelligence had failed to grasp not just the scale of American production, but the transformation of production methods that made such scale possible. Traditional shipbuilding assumed skilled craftsmen, custom construction, and careful fitting of components. America had revolutionized the process, turning ship construction into assembly line manufacturing. This was not something Japanese intelligence could have predicted because it had never been done before. No nation had ever industrialized naval construction to that degree. Vice Admiral Fukudome spoke about the psychological impact on Japanese planning. Even knowing they were outproduced, they had believed tactical superiority, fighting spirit, and defensive advantages could balance the equation. The kamikaze campaign represented this thinking. If one pilot could sink a carrier, the exchange ratio favored Japan, even accounting for losses. But what if America had 10 carriers for every one Japan could sink? What if damaged carriers were repaired in weeks, not months? What if the replacement carriers arriving were better than their predecessors, equipped with improved radar, better fighters, more experienced crews? The kamikaze campaign had killed thousands of young pilots to sink or damage dozens of ships. A terrible sacrifice for minimal strategic impact against an enemy with functionally unlimited replacement capacity. Hansen asked about specific battles where Japanese intelligence had been most wrong. Toyoda mentioned the battle off Samar during the Leyte Gulf engagement. Admiral Kurita had encountered what he believed was the main American carrier force, the kind of fleet Japan would commit to a decisive battle. It was actually Taffy 3, an escort carrier group designated for ground support and anti-submarine patrol. 6 escort carriers, the smallest, slowest carriers in the American inventory, screened by destroyers and destroyer escorts. A secondary force that would be considered inadequate for fleet action. Yet even these 6 small carriers, supported by their escorts' desperate attacks, had put up such fierce resistance that Kurita believed he was engaging a much larger force. He ordered retreat at the moment. He could have destroyed the landing force at Leyte. Why did he make this decision? Because he could not imagine that what he was facing was a secondary force. The volume of aircraft, the intensity of defense, the presence of multiple carriers suggested to him that this must be the main American fleet. He knew the Americans had resources, but 6 escort carriers with their escorts fighting like a fleet action force exceeded his mental model of American operational deployment. He retreated not because the force he faced was too strong, but because he believed it indicated even stronger forces nearby. He was wrong. But his error was based on intelligence that said America could not casually deploy carrier forces of this strength in secondary roles. The production numbers revealed why Kurita's assumption was wrong. America had so many carriers that escort carriers vessels Japan had no real equivalent for could be deployed in numbers sufficient to mount fleet action resistance. What Japan would commit as a main force, America deployed as convoy escort. This was the war Japan had actually fought, not ship against ship, but entire concepts of naval operation against concepts that operated on different scales of resources. Admiral Toyoda asked one final question before the interview concluded. He asked Commander Hansen whether American leadership had always known these production figures would be achieved, or whether the scale of mobilization had surprised American planners as well. Hansen's answer was honest. Initial American production goals had been ambitious, but not wildly beyond historical precedent. However, as industrial mobilization accelerated, as new construction techniques proved successful, as facilities expanded beyond initial plans, American production exceeded even optimistic American projections. The Kaiser shipyards had originally planned to produce Liberty ships at rates comparable to traditional construction, perhaps cutting 20 or 30% off normal construction time. Instead, they had achieved reductions of 70 to 80%. This was not planned. It emerged from iterative improvements, from workers and engineers finding faster methods, from the American industrial culture of continuous efficiency improvement. Similarly, escort carrier production had been planned at modest rates, but prefabrication techniques pioneered in the program proved so successful that production rates doubled, then tripled initial projections. By 1944, escort carriers were being commissioned faster than crews could be fully trained to man them. So in a sense, both nations had been surprised by American industrial capacity. Japan had underestimated it catastrophically. America had exceeded its own expectations significantly, but the critical difference was that American planners revised their strategies upward as production proved capable of supporting expanded operations. Japanese planners revised their estimates upward, but never fast enough, never comprehensively enough to grasp the true scale of what they faced. The meeting concluded with formal courtesies. Admiral Toyoda thanked Commander Hansen for the frankness of the discussion. Hansen expressed respect for Japanese officers who had fought with honor under impossible circumstances. But both men understood that honor and courage had been irrelevant against the industrial mismatch revealed by those production charts. Admiral Toyoda left the building and returned to the vehicle that would take him back through the ruins of Yokohama. The city had been firebombed in May 1945, one of dozens of Japanese cities systematically destroyed by B-29 raids. From the vehicle window, he could see the evidence of American industrial power in the destruction itself, the scale of bombing raids that could reduce cities to ash because bomb production, aircraft, production, fuel supplies, all operated at levels that made such campaigns sustainable. How many bombs had been dropped on Japanese cities? Hundreds of thousands of tons. Each bomb represented steel, explosives, and precision manufacturing. Each bombing raid involved dozens or hundreds of aircraft, each aircraft itself a complex machine requiring thousands of hours of labor to produce. The ruins Toyoda drove through were not the result of Japanese military failure in any tactical sense. They were the result of an industrial capacity gap so vast that resistance had been mathematically futile. In the weeks following that September interview, Admiral Toyoda and Vice Admiral Fukudome provided additional testimony to the Strategic Bombing Survey. They detailed Japanese strategic thinking at various phases of the war, explained intelligence estimates, described the evolution of tactics as Japanese strength declined. Throughout these sessions, both men repeatedly returned to the production figures. They asked for details about specific vessel types. They requested information about construction techniques. They seemed driven by a need to understand exactly how thoroughly their pre-war intelligence had failed. Fukudome, in one session, asked about the timeline of American carrier construction. Hansen provided a detailed breakdown showing when each carrier was laid down, launched, and commissioned. Fukudome traced through the list with his finger, pausing at the dates. In November 1943 alone, America had commissioned 7 escort carriers. In 1 month, more carriers than Japan had built in the entire previous year. Fukudome asked, when these carriers were commissioned, where did the crew come from? Surely training naval aviators and ship crews requires years? Hansen explained the American training pipeline. Massive expansion of training facilities. Simplified training programs that taught adequacy rather than perfection, getting functional pilots and sailors operational quickly, with additional training happening in operational units. The training system itself had been industrialized, producing crew at rates matched to ship production. Japan's training system had been built around peacetime assumptions of small numbers of highly skilled personnel. When losses mounted, the system could not scale to replacement requirements. Veteran pilots and sailors died, taking their experience with them. Replacement crews were increasingly inexperienced, thrust into combat without adequate training because fuel shortages limited training hours. By 1945, the qualitative gap had become as significant as the quantitative gap. American naval crews were better trained, better equipped, supported by better intelligence and better technology, and there were vastly more of them. This was the compound effect of the industrial gap. Not just more ships, but more of everything required to make ships effective. More fuel for training, more radar sets for detection, more radios for communication, more ammunition for practice, more spare parts for maintenance, more repair ships to service damaged vessels at sea rather than requiring return to port. The American Pacific Fleet by 1945 was not just larger than the Japanese Navy. It was a qualitatively different kind of military organization, one whose operational capabilities were enabled by an industrial and logistics base that operated on scales Japan could not match even at peak capacity. Admiral Toyoda would live until 1957, dying at age 72. In his post-war years, he wrote extensively about the war, providing one of the most comprehensive Japanese perspectives on naval strategy and decision-making. In his writings, he returned repeatedly to the intelligence failure regarding American production. He argued that if Japanese leadership had understood the true scale of American industrial capacity, the decision to attack Pearl Harbor would have been recognized as suicidal. No amount of tactical brilliance, fighting spirit, or strategic positioning could overcome a 20-to-1 disadvantage in production capacity. He was careful not to excuse Japanese militarism or the atrocities committed by Japanese forces during the war, but he insisted that the strategic decision to fight America had been based on false premises about what kind of war it would be. Japanese planners had prepared to fight a military campaign where qualitative superiority and defensive advantages could balance material disadvantage. Instead, they had fought an industrial campaign where material advantage was so overwhelming that tactical considerations became irrelevant. Vice Admiral Fukudome, in his post-war memoirs, wrote more bitterly. He argued that Japanese intelligence services had been negligent, that the pre-war assessments had been built on wishful thinking rather than rigorous analysis, that officers who had suggested American capacity might be vastly larger than official estimates had been dismissed as defeatist. Whether this criticism was fair is debatable. Japanese intelligence had conducted extensive surveillance. Their pre-war estimates were based on actual analysis of American shipyards, industrial capacity, and historical production rates. What they had failed to anticipate was the revolutionary transformation of production methods that would make mass production of complex vessels possible. No intelligence service in 1941 could have predicted that America would successfully apply assembly line techniques to warship construction. It had never been done. The very concept violated traditional assumptions about what naval construction required. But the failure remained catastrophic. Japan had based its most consequential strategic decision, whether to fight the United States, on intelligence that was off by factors of 10 to 20 in the most critical metrics. The result was a war that killed millions and destroyed Japan's empire, fought in pursuit of objectives that were mathematically unattainable from the beginning. The Strategic Bombing Survey completed its work in 1946, producing hundreds of pages of detailed analysis about the Pacific War. The sections dealing with Japanese intelligence and strategic planning drew heavily on the interviews with officers like Toyoda and Fukudome. One conclusion stood out. Japan had fought the war blind. Not completely blind, they had known they were outnumbered and had understood American industrial advantages existed, but blind to the scale of disadvantage, blind to how quickly American production would reach peak capacity, blind to how thoroughly industrial might would determine outcomes regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. The report noted that even in 1945, as Japan faced invasion and complete defeat, military leadership continued to believe that resistance might achieve negotiated terms. This belief persisted because they still did not fully understand the extent of American resources. They believed they were facing an enemy stretched to the limit of capacity, when actually American forces were operating well within sustainable operational limits. The atomic bombs forced surrender not just through their destructive power, but by demonstrating that America possessed weapons of qualitatively different lethality that could be deployed without the massive invasion force Japan hoped to bloody in a final defensive stand. But even here, the Japanese leadership did not know that America had already prepared to manufacture atomic weapons at scale if necessary. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not the only nuclear weapons America possessed, and production capacity existed to create more. The war ended in August 1945, not because Japan had been defeated in any single decisive battle, but because continued resistance became impossible. The merchant fleet was destroyed, food supplies were critical, fuel was nearly exhausted, strategic materials were unavailable. The industrial capacity that remained was insufficient to sustain operations, and the enemy showed no signs of weakening. Every campaign, every battle, every engagement brought more American ships, more aircraft, more resources. The mathematical impossibility of victory had become undeniable even to the most fanatical resistance advocates. The knowledge Admiral Toyoda gained in that Yokohama conference room was knowledge purchased at the cost of millions of lives. Japanese military deaths exceeded 2 million. Civilian deaths from bombing, starvation, and battle approached 1 million. Allied deaths, American, British, Chinese, and other nations, numbered in the hundreds of thousands, all in service of a war that production figures from 1943 onward showed was unwinnable. This is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the revelation. By the time Admiral Toyoda saw those numbers in September 1945, they were merely historical documentation. The knowledge could change nothing, could save no one, could alter no decisions. Every kamikaze pilot who had flown into American ships believed he was turning the tide. Every naval officer who had commanded forces in hopeless battles thought tactical skill might prevail. Every soldier who had fought to the death on Pacific Islands believing the sacrifice served a strategic purpose. All had died in service of a cause that production statistics revealed as futile. The numbers on that chart were not just production figures, they were a mathematical proof of impossibility, an equation where no variable representing courage, tactics, or fighting spirit could balance against the industrial disparity. Japan had fought World War II the way a medieval army might fight an industrial age force, with valor, with skill, with determination, and with absolutely no chance of victory. The implications of what Admiral Toyoda learned extended far beyond personal disillusionment. The production figures represented a fundamental challenge to the entire narrative structure through which Japan's military leadership understood the war they had fought. In the months following Japan's surrender, as occupation forces established control and war crimes tribunals began their work, former military officers grappled with questions of responsibility. Who bore blame for a war that had devastated Japan and killed millions? What did responsibility mean when the war had been unwinnable from the start? Admiral Toyoda faced these questions directly. As the last commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, he was called to testify at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the Tokyo war crimes trials that began in May 1946. The prosecution sought to establish a pattern of aggressive war planning, of knowing participation in a conspiracy to dominate Asia through military force. The defense argued that military officers had followed orders, had operated within their professional duties, and had not participated in policy decisions about whether to go to war. Toyoda's testimony touched on the production disparities that had shaped the war. He described the evolution of Japanese strategic thinking as intelligence estimates were revised upward. He explained that by 1944, Japanese military leadership understood they faced overwhelming material disadvantage, but believed continued resistance might achieve terms better than unconditional surrender. The prosecution pressed, "When did you know the war was unwinnable?" Toyoda's answer was carefully precise. He had known defeat was likely by mid-1944. He had known defeat was probable by early 1945. But he had not known the war had been mathematically unwinnable from the beginning until after surrender, when American production figures were revealed. This distinction mattered. If Japanese leadership had known in 1941 that American industrial capacity would reach the levels actually achieved, would they have chosen war? If they had known in 1942 that the production gap was insurmountable, would they have sought negotiations? These questions were ultimately unanswerable. Historical counterfactuals cannot be proven. But Toyoda maintained that better intelligence about American capacity would have fundamentally altered Japanese strategic calculations. The decision to attack Pearl Harbor rested on assumptions about the kind of war that would follow, assumptions that were catastrophically wrong. The tribunal ultimately did not indict Toyoda for war crimes. Unlike some other senior officers, he was not implicated in atrocities or violations of the laws of war. His role had been operational command in a losing campaign. The tribunal determined that fighting a war, even a losing one, did not constitute a crime, absent other criminal conduct. He was released from custody in 1948 and lived the remainder of his life in Japan, writing and speaking about the war. Vice Admiral Fukudome faced more severe scrutiny. As a senior planning officer, he had been involved in strategic decision-making from the beginning of the war. The prosecution examined his role in developing the operational plans for the Pearl Harbor attack and subsequent campaigns. Fukudome's defense centered on the argument that operational planners worked within strategic parameters set by political leadership. He had not decided whether Japan should go to war with the United States. He had planned how to fight that war once the decision was made. His testimony about intelligence failures became a key point. He described how intelligence estimates about American production had been based on the best available information. He explained that the estimates had been revised multiple times as the war revealed them to be inadequate. He maintained that no intelligence service in 1941 could have predicted the scale and speed of American industrial mobilization. The prosecution countered that even if exact figures were unknowable, Japanese leadership should have recognized the fundamental mismatch between Japanese and American industrial capacity. America had 10 times Japan's population, vastly more natural resources, and established industrial infrastructure that dwarfed Japan's. These were known facts. The decision to fight America despite these disadvantages was at minimum reckless, arguably criminal in its disregard for the predictable consequences. Fukudome's response highlighted the tension between pre-war intelligence and wartime reality. Yes, Japan had known America possessed superior resources, but they had believed quality could compensate for quantity, that defensive advantages could multiply Japanese strength, that American will could be broken by early defeats. These were not unreasonable military assumptions given historical precedents of smaller powers successfully resisting larger ones through determination and tactical superiority. What Japanese leadership had not accounted for was the qualitative transformation of American military power through industrial mobilization. Not just more of the same weapons, but better weapons produced faster using innovative methods. Not just larger forces, but forces with logistical support that enabled sustained operations at distances that had previously been impossible. The tribunal ultimately found Fukudome guilty of participating in the planning of aggressive war, but not guilty of specific war crimes. He served several years in prison before being released in the early 1950s. Beyond the legal proceedings, the revelations about American production capacity forced broader reconsideration of the Pacific War's history. Japanese military historians, public intellectuals, and former officers wrote extensively about the intelligence failures that had led to catastrophe. Some argued that the failures were specific to naval intelligence, that the Army had similarly underestimated American and Soviet capabilities, leading to disastrous campaigns in China and the planned invasion of Siberia that never materialized. Others suggested the failures reflected fundamental problems with Japanese institutional culture, unwillingness to acknowledge bad news, pressure to provide optimistic assessments, lack of critical analysis of assumptions. A particularly harsh critique came from junior officers who had survived the war. These men, who had fought the battles and witnessed the steady erosion of Japanese strength, felt betrayed by leadership that had committed them to an unwinnable campaign. The production figures confirmed what many had suspected, that their sacrifices had been in vain, that the war had been lost before they ever entered combat. Lieutenant Commander Haruki Iki, who survived sinking of 3 destroyers during his service, wrote in a 1949 memoir, "We were told we fought with honor. We were told our sacrifices had meaning. Then we learned that while we died defending each meter of ocean, the enemy was building new fleets faster than we could sink old ones. What honor is there in dying for a cause that mathematics had already proven futile?" This sentiment, the sense that courage and sacrifice had been rendered meaningless by industrial disparity, pervaded much of the post-war Japanese military writing. The Bushido Code that had sustained the Japanese fighting spirit emphasized duty, honor, and willingness to die for one's country. But what did these values mean when death served no strategic purpose? When tactical victories were irrelevant because operational defeat was predetermined by production numbers? Some former officers found meaning in the idea that they had fought to defend their homeland, that their efforts, however futile, had been morally necessary regardless of outcome. Others concluded that the entire war had been a criminal waste of life, that leadership that knew or should have known the war was unwinnable had a duty to seek peace rather than prolong carnage. Admiral Toyoda positioned himself in the first camp. In his writings, he argued that once war had been declared, military officers had no choice but to fight with maximum effectiveness. The decision to fight America might have been strategic folly, but once made, it became the duty of officers and sailors to execute their orders, regardless of personal beliefs about the war's winnability. This argument satisfied some observers, but struck others as moral evasion. If the war was unwinnable, did officers not have a duty to tell political leadership this? If intelligence estimates were clearly inadequate, should military planners not have demanded better information before committing to catastrophic campaigns? These debates played out in Japanese intellectual circles throughout the 1950s and 60s. They reflected broader questions about responsibility, duty, and the moral obligations of military professionals in democracies, or in Japan's case, in an imperial system that had democratic forms but authoritarian substance. The American perspective on these revelations was quite different. For American military planners and historians, the production figures confirmed the effectiveness of strategic decisions made early in the war. President Franklin Roosevelt's commitment to massive industrial mobilization, the arsenal of democracy concept, had proven decisive. The decision to prioritize industrial expansion even before America formally entered the war had created the production capacity that made victory inevitable once that capacity was fully engaged against the Axis powers. American strategic bombing surveys emphasized that victory had not been accidental or primarily due to tactical superiority. It had been engineered through systematic application of industrial capacity to military production. The surveys documented how American planners had calculated required production levels, had methodically built the shipyards and factories needed to meet those levels, and had successfully executed the mobilization plan. From this perspective, Japanese intelligence failures were not surprising. No nation in history had industrialized war production to the degree America achieved between 1941 and 1945. Japanese intelligence had based estimates on historical precedents that turned out to be irrelevant once America transformed the fundamental nature of military production. Some American analysts argued that the production advantage had been so overwhelming that it had actually limited American strategic flexibility. With such vast resources, American planners could pursue strategies that would have been impossibly risky for any other nation. The island-hopping campaign, with its massive logistical requirements and high casualty rates in contested landings, was feasible only because American industrial capacity could sustain the losses and replace consumed materials. A more resource-constrained military would have needed to pursue different strategies, perhaps focusing on blockade, perhaps seeking negotiated settlements of some kind. America's industrial advantage had made such considerations unnecessary. Victory could be achieved through straightforward application of superior force. This analysis suggested that Japanese hopes for negotiated peace had been doomed not just by production disparities, but by American strategic culture. With the capacity to achieve complete victory, American leadership had no incentive to accept anything less than unconditional surrender. The production numbers gave American planners confidence that they could sustain campaigns until Japan was physically incapable of continued resistance. The broader historical significance of the production disparities extended beyond the Pacific War itself. The revelations influenced Cold War strategic thinking in both American and Soviet military planning. American defense planners concluded that industrial mobilization capacity was as important as standing military forces. The ability to rapidly expand production in wartime provided strategic depth that standing armies could not match. This thinking influenced American defense policy throughout the Cold War, maintaining large industrial capacity even during peacetime, ensuring that production could be scaled rapidly if needed. The Soviet Union drew similar conclusions, but with different emphasis. Soviet planners, observing what American industrial capacity had achieved, sought to build their own industrial base capable of matching Western production. The massive expansion of Soviet heavy industry in the 1950s and 60s reflected lessons learned from the Pacific War, that modern warfare required industrial foundations capable of sustaining prolonged high-intensity conflict. Japanese strategic thinking shifted dramatically. Post-war Japan, prohibited from maintaining significant military forces by the peace treaty and its new constitution, focused instead on economic reconstruction and industrial development. Some historians have argued this represented an unconscious application of lessons from the production disparities, that economic power provided strategic security more effectively than military power in the modern world. The Japanese economic miracle of the 1960s through 80s, where Japan became the second largest economy in the world, reflected commitment to industrial capacity that in some ways mirrored American wartime mobilization. Japanese industry became renowned for production efficiency, quality control, and innovative manufacturing techniques, ironic echoes of the American industrial advantages that had defeated Imperial Japan. Admiral Toyoda's final years were spent largely in reflection and writing. He maintained correspondence with former officers, with historians studying the war, and interestingly, with some American naval officers he had fought against. One such correspondence, preserved in archives, was with Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had commanded American forces at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The two men exchanged letters discussing tactical decisions, strategic considerations, and the role of intelligence in shaping the war. In a letter from 1954, Toyoda wrote to Spruance, "I have come to understand that we were not fighting the same war. You commanded forces whose strength grew with each passing month. I commanded forces that grew weaker, no matter how hard we fought. This was not a difference of degree but of kind. You planned campaigns knowing that losses could be replaced and sustained operations were possible. I planned knowing that every loss was permanent, that every campaign depleted irreplaceable strength. We used the same words, strategy, tactics, operational planning, but the meanings were fundamentally different because the material realities were so disparate." Spruance's response acknowledged this disparity, but noted that American forces had also faced their own challenges. The vast distances of the Pacific required logistical capabilities that were unprecedented. The need to coordinate multiple fleet task forces, to sustain operations thousands of miles from bases, to maintain supply lines vulnerable to submarine attack. These were not simple problems solved merely by having more ships. But Spruance admitted that the fundamental calculation had always favored America. "We knew that losses were sustainable if the strategic objectives were achieved. This knowledge allowed offensive operations that would have been impossibly risky for a force that could not replace losses." In this sense, industrial capacity was not merely an advantage, it was what made our strategic approach possible at all. This exchange captured the essential nature of the production disparity's impact. It had not simply made victory easier for America, it had enabled an entirely different way of conducting military operations, one where attrition was acceptable because the attritional exchange ratio was sustainable. By the time of Admiral Toyoda's death in 1957, the story of the production disparities had become established in historical literature about the Pacific War. Books and articles had documented the figures, analyzed their significance, explored the intelligence failures that had led Japan to underestimate American capacity so dramatically, but the human dimension of the revelation, what it meant for individual officers like Toyoda to learn that the war they had fought was mathematically unwinnable, remained less explored. The psychological impact of discovering that courage, skill, and sacrifice had been rendered strategically irrelevant by industrial mathematics was difficult to convey in dry historical analysis. Toyoda's writings in his final years returned repeatedly to this theme. He described conversations with former subordinates who struggled with the meaning of their wartime service. How did one find honor in fighting a lost cause? What did duty mean when executing orders in service of strategic impossibility? His answers evolved over time. Initially, he emphasized the traditional military virtues that officers had no choice but to fight regardless of odds. That duty required executing orders without question, that honor existed in the fighting itself regardless of outcome. But in later writings, a more nuanced perspective emerged. He began to argue that the true failure had been political and institutional rather than military. Military forces had fought as well as possible given their resources. The catastrophic failure had been the decision to enter a war that proper intelligence would have, revealed as unwinnable. This shifted the locus of responsibility. Junior officers and enlisted men who had fought and died had fulfilled their duties. Senior officers who had executed campaigns had done so within the strategic parameters they were given. But the political and military leadership that had decided to attack Pearl Harbor based on inadequate intelligence about American capacity, they bore responsibility for the catastrophe that followed. In one of his final published essays, Toyoda wrote, "The production figures I saw in September 1945 taught me that courage is not enough. That fighting spirit cannot overcome material reality. Those wars are won not by the army that fights hardest, but by the nation that can sustain fighting the longest. These are bitter lessons, learned at the cost of millions of lives. I hope future generations will study these lessons and never again commit to wars based on hope and determination, while ignoring the mathematics of nevermatics, industrial capacity." Vice Admiral Fukudome, who outlived Toyoda by nearly 2 decades, provided a different perspective in his later writings. Where Toyoda emphasized duty and the tragedy of fighting an unwinnable war, Fukudome focused more on the institutional failures that had produced flawed intelligence. In a 1968 interview, near the end of his life, Fukudome reflected, "The numbers we estimated were not random guesses. They were based on careful analysis by intelligent officers, but the analysis rested on assumptions about what was possible that turned out to be wrong. We assumed shipbuilding required certain methods, certain timeframes, certain skilled labor. America changed the rules. They industrialized what we thought required craftsmanship. They mass-produced what we believed required custom construction. We were not stupid, we were operating with a framework that became obsolete during the war itself." This was perhaps the most charitable interpretation of the intelligence failure. That Japanese estimates had been reasonable given the information available and historical precedents, but that American innovation had transformed the nature of production faster than intelligence could adapt. Critics of this view argued that the signs had been visible much earlier, that Japanese leadership had ignored warning indicators because they contradicted desired conclusions. Reports from the field about American force levels had been dismissed as exaggerations, that the systematic underestimation of American capacity reflected institutional bias rather than mere analytical error. The truth likely involved elements of both perspectives. Japanese intelligence had conducted serious analysis based on real information, but the analysis had been constrained by assumptions that proved incorrect, and the institutional culture had been resistant to revising estimates upward, even as evidence accumulated that initial projections were catastrophically low. The final testimony of what the production figures meant came not from admirals or generals, but from the ordinary sailors and soldiers who had fought in the Pacific. Their memoirs, published decades after the war, provided ground-level perspectives on what it meant to fight an enemy with seemingly infinite resources. Petty Officer Saburo Sakai, who served on multiple destroyers throughout the war, described the psychological impact of seeing American convoy sizes grow over time. Early in the war, a significant American convoy might consist of a dozen transport ships with modest escort. By 1944, convoys of 50 or more ships, escorted by dozens of destroyers and carriers, had become routine. We would attack these convoys, knowing we might sink 1 or 2 ships before being driven off or destroyed, Sakai wrote in his memoir. But there was always another convoy, always more ships. We joked grimly that America must have found a way to grow ships like rice. But it was not. Funny. Every mission felt futile. We fought knowing that our victories, when we achieved them, meant nothing to the overall campaign. This sense of futility pervaded many Japanese veterans' accounts. They had fought individual battles with courage and skill, but the strategic hopelessness of the overall campaign had been apparent long before the production figures quantified exactly how hopeless. Corporal Yukio Takata, who served in island defense forces, described similar experiences. American invasion forces would bombard an island for days or weeks before landing. The sheer volume of shells and bombs, the number of ships capable of maintaining sustained bombardment, exceeded anything Japanese forces could match. After the bombardment, when American forces landed, they had everything, Takata wrote. Tanks, artillery, ammunition in quantities we could never imagine, medical supplies, food, equipment. We scraped by on limited rations, short of ammunition, short of everything. They fought with abundance. This was not a difference of degree. It was like we were fighting a different kind of war. These accounts from enlisted personnel provided texture to the statistical realities the production figures represented. The numbers, thousands of ships, millions of tons of supplies translated at the human level into experiences of fighting an enemy who never seemed constrained by the resource limitations that defined Japanese operations. In the decades since the war, historians have continued to analyze the production disparities and their significance. Modern scholarship has access to documents and data that were classified during the immediate post-war period, allowing more comprehensive analysis. One area of particular interest has been the question of when American planners knew that victory was assured by production advantages. Declassified documents from 1943 show that by mid-year, American strategic planners were operating with confidence, but that material superiority would guarantee eventual victory. The question was not whether Japan could be defeated, but how long it would take and what it would cost. This knowledge shaped American strategic decisions throughout 1944 and 1945. The debate over whether to invade the Japanese home islands versus continuing the blockade and bombing campaign rested partly on calculations of American casualty tolerance. But the debate assumed victory was certain regardless of approach. It was a question of method, not outcome. Japanese planners, lacking accurate information about American production, continued to operate as if the outcome remained uncertain. Strategic planning documents from 1945 show Japanese military leadership calculating how to inflict maximum casualties on invasion forces, hoping to make the cost of victory unacceptable to American public opinion. These plans were not irrational given what Japanese leadership believed about American capacity and will, but they were based on fundamentally flawed premises about how much attrition America could sustain. The production figures show that America could have absorbed far higher casualty rates than Japan inflicted and still maintained operational capability. The gap between Japanese perception and American reality remained vast until the moment of surrender. Even after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even after the Soviet Union entered the war, elements of Japanese military leadership advocated continued resistance. They believed incorrectly that American forces were stretched thin, that one more major defensive victory might force negotiations. The production figures reveal how delusional this belief was. American forces in August 1945 were at peak strength, with reinforcements available to sustain operations indefinitely. The atomic bombs had accelerated the end, but conventional campaigns would have achieved the same result, eventually just at higher cost to both sides. The legacy of Admiral Toyoda's revelation in that Yokohama conference room extends far beyond historical documentation. It represents a case study in the decisive importance of accurate intelligence, in the catastrophic consequences of strategic planning based on flawed assumptions, and in the human cost of fighting wars that mathematics has already decided. Modern military planners study the Pacific War's production disparities as a lesson in the relationship between industrial capacity and military effectiveness. The emergence of precision-guided weapons, nuclear deterrence, and advanced technology has shifted the nature of military advantage since World War II. But the fundamental principle remains: sustained military operations require industrial foundations capable of supporting them. For Japan, the lessons shaped post-war strategic thinking in subtle but profound ways. The nation that had bet its future on military conquest and lost catastrophically became a nation that pursued economic power instead. The industrial capacity that America had used to defeat Japan became a model for Japanese economic development. There is irony in this. The production methods that Henry Kaiser pioneered in shipbuilding prefabrication, just-in-time component delivery, continuous process improvement became hallmarks of Japanese manufacturing excellence in the post-war period. Japan learned from defeat what America had learned from mobilization, that industrial efficiency and production capacity could be systematically developed through innovative methods and institutional commitment. Admiral Toyoda died on September 11, 1957, at age 72. He had lived 12 years after learning the production figures that reframed his understanding of the war he had fought. Those 12 years had been spent in a kind of psychological aftermath, processing knowledge that arrived too late to save anyone but early, enough to shadow his remaining years with the weight of understanding what all the sacrifice had been in service of. In his final writings, he returned to the question he had asked Commander Hansen in September 1945. If we had known these numbers in 1941, would we still have attacked? His answer, refined over years of reflection, was nuanced. The production disparities made the war unwinnable. Yes, but Japanese strategic thinking in 1941 had been driven by factors beyond simple military calculation: fear of encirclement by Western powers, resource desperation, as America, Britain, and the Dutch East Indies imposed oil embargoes, a cultural and political climate that valued aggressive action over accommodation. Accurate intelligence about American production capacity might have changed the decision, but it might not have. Strategic decisions are made in complex political environments where perfect information does not guarantee rational choices. What the production figures proved, beyond any doubt, was that once the decision to fight was made, the outcome was predetermined, not by any single battle, not by tactical errors or command failures, but by industrial mathematics that no amount of courage or skill could overcome. This knowledge was Admiral Toyoda's burden for the final 12 years of his life. The understanding that every order he had given, every campaign he had planned, every sailor under his command who had died, had been in service of a cause that production statistics revealed as futile from the beginning. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.